overlooking the disastrous outcome of the qualifying session on Saturday and focusing only on the events on Sunday afternoon at the 4.909-kilometer Autodromo Internazionale Enzo e Dino Ferrari. Ferrari had a very good race in the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, the 7th round of the 2025 Formula One Championship. Pit stop timing and overall strategy were generally correct. The only flaw may have been the handling of car number 16, Charles Leclerc's, during the safety car period, but we will look into that later. On paper, finishing the race on the Pirelli C6 tyre did not seem feasible given a short interruption, but perhaps a more aggressive approach could have yielded a surprise in the end. In the first part of the race, Ferrari's drivers followed two opposite strategies. Charles Leclerc started on medium tires and shortened the first stint significantly to undercut George Russell. The Monegasque, who was overall 0.6 slower than Verstappen, correctly chose to get rid of the drag reduction system train by pitting early and committing to a two-stop strategy. Lewis Hamilton did not have that option, as he was forced to run long on the hard tires. The British driver was partially held up by Kimi Antonelli, which explains his slower lap times. The Britons suffered a lot in dirty air, losing on average more than a second per lap to Max Verstappen's Red Bull. The world champion, thanks to a textbook overtake on Oscar Piastri at Tamburello after the start, showed an untouchable pace. The Australian chose to switch strategy, pitting after just 11 laps. Lando Norris struggled to get past George Russell, losing time to the leading duo. Degradation data shows the British driver was stuck behind his compatriot until the latter pitted, after which he matched Max Verstappen's pace. In the second part of the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, the two SF25 cars put on a show for the fans. But the pace could have been better, considering Ferrari's drivers made several overtakes on a track where such moves are very difficult to perform, leaving some potential untapped. The spectacular race, somewhat atypical for the circuit on the banks of the Santerno River, was helped by strong headwinds on the main straight, which increased top speeds. That also explains why we saw more overtakes than expected with the DRS system. Charles Leclerc was slower than his teammate due to a worse track position. The Monegasque's inconsistent lap times were the result of the overtakes he had to make. Mercedes did not live up to the promising signs from free practice. George Russell, who started third, never found the right rhythm. In the middle part of the race, he was on average 2 seconds per lap slower than Lando Norris. Kimi Antonelli managed his tires better but was stopped by a throttle failure. The young Italian driver, who was not performing poorly in the race, used his excellent top speed at the end of the straight to defend and compensate for the shortcomings in his W16's race pace at Imola. The final stint was handled differently by the teams. The deciding factor was the availability of new tires and the risk of losing positions. Among the top drivers, Max Verstappen, Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton made their final stops during the safety car period. Thanks to the tire advantage, the Ferrari and McLaren drivers regained positions over their teammates by pushing without concern for tire wear. Charles Leclerc was unable to stop the performance drop in the final part of the stint due to excessive degradation, losing position to Alexander Albon's Williams, which had fresh tires. Piastri, with McLaren, managed the start of the stint more steadily. That allowed him to mitigate the performance drop in the final part of the race, holding off Hamilton's charge. So can 4th and 6th place at the Imola checkered flag leave Ferrari smiling? At first glance, the question might seem strange, considering the prestige of the prancing horse and, more importantly, the expectations that surrounded the season's start. However, in a weekend that seemed doomed by Saturday's disappointing qualifying, Lewis Hamilton's near podium and Charles Leclerc's comeback, more unfortunate than the final 6th place suggests, partly softened the blow, even while confirming that the path to the top remains long. That said, Ferrari showed a solid response in the race, not so much in terms of outright pace or the typical Saturday to Sunday tire management improvement, but more so strategically and in seizing opportunities. After a disappointing qualifying, it was clear from the start that bold moves were needed to try for a recovery, and that is what happened. Ferrari correctly diversified strategies to cover more scenarios. If the Britain's race followed a more linear approach, his Maranello teammates highlighted excellent strategic insight from the Ferrari pit wall, which has made significant progress in this area over the past year. With little to lose, the choice to pit early to put rivals under pressure proved effective, capitalizing on George Russell's struggles with tire management. Charles Leclerc undercut no fewer than 4 cars, including the Williams of Carlos Sainz, which would have been hard to overtake on track. The early arrival of the virtual safety car and later the safety car certainly did not help the Monegasque. Yet a doubt remains. Would it really have made sense for Charles Leclerc to fit soft tires and end the race on the attack as he wanted? It is a valid question, and one Ferrari was prepared to answer. The idea to switch to softs was initially the Monegasque's. Even before Kimi Antonelli's retirement, he had already radioed in saying his tires were at the limit. In a low-grip phase after the restart, it was understandable why he was pushing for a stop. However, when it came time to decide, there was some confusion, including in communications. In the end, Charles Leclerc chose to stay out on the hards, fearing he would be stuck behind his teammate, who had just pitted, and lose further positions. "I don't want to end up stuck behind him and lose even more spots," he said over the radio. That fear was understandable, though it deserves scrutiny. Isaac Hadjar, for instance, would not have been a factor, since he had a 5-second gap even before the virtual safety car. While he might have lost something trying to stay clear of Lewis Hamilton, realistically there would have been no real issue with Isaac Hadjar. The bigger risk, aside from a pit stop issue, was something Charles Leclerc couldn't have known: the possibility of rejoining behind Carlos Sainz, who would not stop due to having no fresh tires. Ferrari was ready to comply with Charles Leclerc's request to switch to softs, but it was the driver himself who changed his mind at the last second, caught off guard by Lewis Hamilton's stop. Here lies an interesting detail. Over the radio, Charles Leclerc was told his teammate wouldn't pit, but in fact the Briton had never said that. On the contrary, he had noted there were still several laps left to run on those tires. Internally, the only discussion was about how many positions he might lose, a standard consideration in such scenarios. In truth, it was fairly obvious that Lewis Hamilton would pit, as he had a fresh set of hards available, unlike those on a 2-stop strategy. But lacking the correct information, Charles Leclerc was surprised and decided to stay out, despite the box giving the go-ahead. When the safety car came out, 17 laps remained. No one expected such a long neutralization, especially with so few lapped cars to let through. But there's another question to ask. What would the real goal have been with the softs? Leclerc would have ended up behind Albon, who had fresh hards, and also behind Hamilton. He also would have needed to pass George Russell, who, like Charles Leclerc, had no fresh tires and would have stayed out, not to mention the risk of rejoining behind Carlos Sainz. Staying out elevated Leclerc to 4th. Pitting would have dropped him to at least 7th, maybe 8th, meaning he'd have had to overtake 3 cars, including his teammate, just to get back to the same position. Of course, he would have had more grip after the restart, but the C6 compound had already shown high overheating on a single lap. The only way to manage that would have been to cool it down for a few laps, which is impossible in race conditions, where thermal degradation would have kicked in after just a few laps, even in clean air. With multiple cars to overtake and track temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, Charles Leclerc might have delivered some early excitement, but maintaining pace until the flag would have been anything but easy. In reality, considering the situation, staying out on the used hard tires turned out to be the more convenient and effective choice.